the rooster crows before dawn. A thin mist clings to the thatched roofs of a medieval village, and the chill of morning creeps into every wooden beam and every farmer's bone. Fires are kindled, bread is torn from the ovens, and in the dim light of taverns and cottages alike, hands reach not for water, but for ale. To a modern eye, it seems strange. Who drinks beer before the day's work has even begun? But to the people of the Middle Ages, beer was not indulgence, it was life itself. For most men, women, and even children, the wells could not be trusted. Water was a trickster, sometimes clear and refreshing, other times harboring sickness, invisible death swimming in every gulp. Brewing was their safeguard, their salvation. By boiling water with grain and herbs and letting it ferment, they made liquid that could be trusted, that would not betray them with fever or plague. And so, from the humblest peasant to the proudest noble, the day began not with water, but with ale. Do not imagine, however, golden streams of froth in glass goblets. Medieval beer was different, a thick, cloudy, sometimes sour concoction. It was grain-made liquid, more bread than beverage, hearty and filling. Small beer, weak and lightly fermented, was given even to children. Stronger brews were saved for feasts, festivals, and men of higher station. Yet however crude it seemed, it carried within it safety, nourishment, and the promise of warmth. Picture the farmer in the fields, wiping sweat from his brow as he lifts a heavy jug of ale. For him it was refreshment and fuel. Picture the monk in his cloister, hands folded in prayer, sipping beer as part of his daily allowance, permitted even in times of fasting. Picture the knight, scarred from battle, quenching his thirst with ale stronger than any peasant could dream of. Across all of Europe, beer was the invisible thread tying these lives together, a common ritual binding lord and laborer, sinner and saint. And beer was not just survival, it was economy, power, and identity. Brewing was labor. It was knowledge passed down from parent to child, secrets whispered in households and monasteries alike. To brew well was to hold status. A family known for good ale could prosper. A monastery with fine beer could enrich its coffers. In villages, beer was a currency, a reward, even a wage. Many a worker received not coin, but pints. Entire towns were defined by the character of their brew, as fiercely proud of their ale as of their walls or their banners. Yet for all its commonness, beer was mysterious. Imagine the awe of a villager who had never heard of yeast, who did not know of bacteria or fermentation. To him, beer was magic. Grain left in water came alive, bubbling, transforming into something rich and intoxicating. Was it God's hand, or a spirit in the air? To the medieval mind, beer was more than a drink. It was a miracle. The monks praised it in hymns, the peasants toasted with it in gratitude, and every barrel rolled into a village square carried not only sustenance, but a little wonder. Still, beer had its dangers. Brewing was a delicate art. Too much water, and the drink was weak. Too little heat, and disease might linger. A spoiled cask meant wasted grain. Grain that could have been bread for a hungry family. Brewing demanded patience, knowledge, and care. Those who mastered it held power in their hands, a quiet authority that went beyond titles and crowns. So when we ask, how did medieval people brew beer? We are not asking a question of recipes alone. We are asking how they lived, how they survived, how they gathered together in joy and endured in hardship. To understand the Middle Ages, one must understand the alehouse, the monastery cellar, the bubbling vats in the cottages of villagers. Beer was not just drink. It was survival, community, identity. It was, in every sense of the word, the drink that defined an era. Before monks in cloisters and peasants in villages ever raised a wooden tankard, the story of beer was already ancient, older than kingdoms, older even than the Middle Ages themselves. To trace the origins of medieval brewing, one must follow the trail of barley back thousands of years, across deserts and rivers, to the cradles of civilization, where humanity first learned that grain could be more than bread. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians praised a goddess named Ninkasi, the lady of fermentation, mother of beer. Their clay tablets, pressed with cuneiform signs, hold hymns not only to the gods, but also to brewing itself. These verses were recipes in song, instructions for soaking bread in water, letting it ferment under the blazing sun, and transforming it into a drink that filled stomachs and lifted spirits. Beer was food and faith entwined, and it was considered divine. From the Sumerians, the Egyptians inherited brewing. Along the Nile, beer became rations for both workers and soldiers. It fueled the very hands that built the pyramids, sustaining them more reliably than water. In tomb paintings and hieroglyphs, we see brewers stirring vats and straining grain, their work considered essential to the living and to the dead. Beer was not just for survival, it was an offering to the gods, a symbol of continuity between this life and the afterlife. When the legions of Rome spread across Europe, they encountered tribes in Gaul, Germania, and Britain, already brewing their own versions of ale. The Romans, lovers of wine, dismissed beer as barbarian swill, fit only for uncivilized northerners. Yet irony has a way of playing tricks on history. For when the empire fell and vineyards withered under chaos, it was beer, this barbarian drink, that endured, rising to define the Europe of the Middle Ages. The so-called Dark Ages, when roads crumbled and cities shrank, were not dark for brewing. In fact, beer flourished. In monasteries scattered across Christendom, monks took up the art. Within stone walls where silence reigned and candles flickered, brewing became as disciplined as prayer. They wrote their methods in careful script, refining recipes, measuring quantities, ensuring consistency. Beer was not a sin, but a gift of God, a sustenance that broke no fast. When bread was scarce, beer became liquid bread, heavy with nutrients, sustaining body and soul alike. Outside the monasteries, brewing was the heartbeat of daily life in villages. Families brewed at home, and alewives, women skilled in the art, became pillars of local survival. Their small batches of ale were consumed quickly, for without preservation, beer spoiled fast. Each region developed its own style, shaped by soil, climate, and custom. The English made lighter ales. Germans began experimenting with stronger, darker brews. In the Low Countries, spices and herbs flavored the drink, turning every village's beer into its own unique signature. One of the greatest transformations came with the introduction of hops. Earlier brewers had flavored their ales with herbs, flowers, even honey. But hops added something extraordinary. Bitterness that balanced sweetness, aroma that gave character, and most importantly, preservation. A hopped beer could travel, could last weeks or months without souring. This was no small thing. It turned beer from a household necessity into a commodity, fueling trade across towns and borders. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the hopped beers of Germany began spreading across Europe, laying the foundation of the modern pint. But brewing was not simply chemistry. To the medieval mind, fermentation was still a mystery. The bubbling froth that rose from a vat was not explained by yeast. Yeast was unknown. Instead, it was seen as a little miracle, a spirit inhabiting the brew, a gift sent from God's hand. Villagers marveled at how lifeless grain could be reborn as living drink. The monasteries saw divine order in its process. And so beer became more than sustenance. It became a story, linking humanity's oldest civilizations to the muddy roads and smoky taverns of the Middle Ages. By the dawn of medieval Europe, brewing was no longer an accident of nature. It was tradition, heritage, and survival. Every mug lifted in a tavern, every cask rolled into a monastery cellar, carried echoes of Mesopotamia and Egypt, of Romans and barbarians, of gods and monks. The Middle Ages did not invent beer, but they inherited it, reshaped it, and made it their own, turning a drink into the beating heart of a civilization. If bread was the staff of life in the Middle Ages, then beer was its liquid companion. Yet behind the frothing jugs and wooden tankards, the recipe was deceptively simple: grain, water, and herbs. Three things every village seemed to have, and yet when joined together, they produced something greater than the sum of their parts. To understand medieval brewing, one must first understand its ingredients, not only what they were, but why they mattered so deeply. At the heart of the brew was barley. Hardy and stubborn, barley thrived where wheat and rye often failed. It resisted the harsh winds of northern Europe, grew in soils too poor for finer grains, and yielded nourishment that could keep both stomach and spirit full. Barley was also forgiving. It malted well, sprouting and releasing sugars that could be coaxed into alcohol. In England, peasants and nobles alike relied heavily on barley for both bread and beer. In Germany and the Low Countries, it became the foundation of regional pride. Without barley, medieval brewing would never have risen from cottage to cathedral. Water, however, was the trickiest of all. To us, it seems absurd that a drink made from water could be safer than water itself. But boiling, steeping, and fermenting transformed it, driving out disease that lurked in stagnant wells. Still, not all waters were equal. A stream running through limestone fields could produce a light, crisp ale. Water drawn from peat-rich bogs lent darker, heavier flavors. Entire towns became famous, or infamous, for the taste of their beer, shaped by the invisible hand of geology. For the medieval brewer, water was both a blessing and a gamble. It carried life, but mishandled, it could also bring death. The third ingredient, though not always present, changed the course of history: hops. For centuries, medieval brewers had relied on a mixture called gruit, a blend of herbs, flowers, or even tree bark: yarrow, rosemary, heather, bog myrtle. These added flavor and sometimes potency. But they could not preserve. A batch of ale soured quickly, forcing villagers to drink it fast or watch it rot. Hops, however, were different. Their natural bitterness balanced the malt's sweetness. Their aroma delighted the nose, and their oils kept spoilage at bay. In short, hops made beer travel, made it last, and made it tradable. The first widespread use of hops appeared in the monasteries of Germany around the 9th century. By the 12th, Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, mystic, and naturalist, wrote of hops' preserving power. Slowly, they spread across Europe, though not without resistance. In some towns, authorities clung to Grut, for they controlled its sale and taxed it heavily. Hops threatened not only tradition, but profit. And yet, the tide could not be turned. By the late Middle Ages, hopped beer had conquered Germany, the Low Countries, and England. It was the birth of the beer we know today. But even with these three pillars, barley, water, and hops, brewing was never uniform. In times of scarcity, brewers turned to oats, wheat, or even beans. In poor villages, beer might be weak and thin, more broth than beverage. In wealthy courts, brews could be spiced with cinnamon, ginger, or exotic imports from the East. Beer was as diverse as the people who brewed it, reflecting soil, season, and society. To sip from a mug in York was not the same as drinking in Cologne, or Ghent, or Krakow. Each taste carried the story of its land. What fascinates most is how these humble ingredients became symbols of survival. Grain was the fruit of toil, water the gift of earth, hops the guardian of time. Together they created not only sustenance, but identity. A town could rise or fall by the reputation of its brew. A monastery's ale could fund its libraries and feed its pilgrims. A family's household beer could mean the difference between hunger and comfort. Beer was not only a drink, it was agriculture, economy, and faith poured into a single cup. So when a medieval man or woman lifted their jug, they were not merely quenching thirst. They were tasting the barley fields waving in the wind, the streams cutting through their homeland, the herbs gathered by careful hands, and, in time, the bitter kiss of hops. Every sip was a communion with the land itself. In that cloudy, frothy brew lay the essence of medieval life: resilience, simplicity, and survival. Step into a medieval brew house, and the first thing you notice is the smell. A thick, earthy sweetness hangs in the air, the scent of damp grain and boiling mash, mixed with smoke from the fire beneath the cauldron. The space is warm, humid, alive with activity. Here, in simple wooden vats and iron kettles, the miracle of beer takes shape. To the medieval brewer, it was not science, but craft, memory, and instinct, an art learned through generations, recorded not in books, but in muscle and habit. The first stage was malting, and it began with barley. Grains were soaked in water until they sprouted, tricking them into life. This sprouting unlocked the sugars hidden inside. After a few days, the grain was spread out on the floor, dried carefully, sometimes in kilns heated with wood or straw. Too much heat, and the grain charred; too little, and it soured. From this process came malt, the beating heart of every brew. Malt carried both sweetness and strength, the promise of alcohol to come. Once malted, the barley was ground, often in small mills, crushed into coarse grist. This was mixed with hot water in a large vat, a process called mashing. The mixture, called wort, released its sugars, turning into a thick, porridge-like liquid. A brewer would stir with long wooden paddles, sweat dripping from brow to cauldron, relying on senses honed by practice. No thermometer guided their hand, no clock marked their hours. They judged by feel, by taste, by the sound of bubbling liquid. Brewing was instinct, an inherited language between brewer and grain. Next came the boil. The wort was drained into a kettle, set over roaring flames, and brought to a furious simmer. Here herbs were added: bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, or, in more advanced brews, hops. The boiling purified the liquid, driving away impurities, while the herbs lent flavor and fragrance. Clouds of steam filled the brewhouse, carrying with them the smell of earth and bitterness. Neighbors might know a brewing day was underway simply by the aroma wafting down the street. Once cooled, the wort was left to ferment. Here was the true magic, the moment that bewildered and awed. To the medieval mind, fermentation was a mystery. They knew only that if wort was left in casks or vats, it came alive. Froth bubbled to the surface, the liquid grew sharp and strong, and after days or weeks it transformed into ale. Today we name yeast as the agent of this miracle, but in the Middle Ages it was unseen, unnamed, a gift of God or spirits of the air. Some brewers even kept barm, frothy residue from previous batches to ensure a steady transformation. Fermentation brought with it uncertainty. A good brew might nourish a village. A spoiled one could ruin its grain stores. Brewers learned to guard their secrets carefully, refining their craft. Some watched the color of the bubbles, others tasted the sweetness on the tongue or smelled the sharpness of the froth. It was a craft of patience, for to rush it was to court disaster. When the beer was ready, it was drawn into wooden casks, oak, ash, or chestnut, and stored in cool cellars or dark corners of homes and monasteries. The first taste was always anxious, for no two brews were identical. One might be rich and hearty, another weak and watery, another too bitter to drink. Yet even the poorest ale was safer than water, and so it was consumed, celebrated, shared. At last, the beer found its way into cups, jugs, and tankards. In cottages, children sipped small beer with their bread. In taverns, men raised mugs in laughter or quarrel. In monasteries, monks drank measured portions, part of their daily rations. And in castles, nobles feasted with strong ales poured into silver goblets. From grain to goblet, beer had traveled a long and uncertain path. Yet it emerged as the constant companion of medieval life, uniting rich and poor, saint and sinner, in one common ritual. It was not simply brewing. It was transformation. Grain into sweetness, sweetness into strength, strength into life. And though they could not name the science, the people of the Middle Ages understood its wonder. To them, beer was not just made. It was born. Imagine the echo of footsteps on cold stone floors, the chanting of monks in dimly lit chapels, the scent of incense curling into the rafters. Within these sacred walls, knowledge was preserved, prayers whispered, and manuscripts copied. Yet tucked away in cellars and brewhouses, another kind of labor was unfolding, one that bound heaven to earth in an unexpected way. The brewing of beer. Monasteries became the great laboratories of medieval Europe, not of alchemy or science as we know it, but of brewing. Monks were disciplined, methodical, and meticulous, and they applied this same rigor to their ale. Unlike the peasants who brewed at home by instinct and guesswork, monks kept written records, refining recipes, adjusting measurements, and repeating processes with unwavering patience. In doing so, they elevated beer from rustic necessity to an art form. Why beer? Because it was sustenance. Monks lived lives of fasting, prayer, and labor. Bread and beer were their staples, and though rules forbade them from indulging in gluttony, beer was often classified as liquid bread, rich in nutrients and permitted even during times when solid food was restricted. In truth, beer kept them alive. It was not just nourishment of the body, but a companion to the soul in their long hours of devotion. But beer was more than survival. It became a source of wealth. Monasteries did not exist apart from society. They were woven into the fabric of their regions. Pilgrims traveling long roads sought hospitality, and monks provided it: food, shelter, and always beer. Villagers turned to monasteries for ale that was cleaner, stronger, and more reliable than what most could make at home. Soon, monasteries were brewing not only for themselves, but for entire communities. This production demanded scale. Monastic breweries were vast compared to the small vats in village cottages. Great wooden tuns held gallons upon gallons of fermenting wort. Stone cellars kept beer cool. Networks of lay brothers and servants ensured that brewing continued alongside farming, winemaking, and manuscript copying. The monastery became a hub of not just faith but commerce, its ale-funding construction, charity, and expansion. Some monasteries became famous for their beer, their names whispered along trade routes and among tavern keepers eager to boast of a monk's brew. It was within these walls, too, that hops took firm root. While many peasants still brewed with gruit, herbal mixtures controlled and taxed by local lords, the monks experimented with hops. They noticed the bitterness balanced sweetness, and more importantly, that the beer lasted longer. A monastery's beer could travel, reaching markets far beyond its walls, spreading reputation and influence. In many ways, it was the monks who laid the groundwork for the modern concept of beer as a product, one that could be brewed, sold, and shipped. Yet even here, brewing was not devoid of the divine. For the monks, fermentation was a holy mystery, the invisible hand of God at work in bubbling casks. They prayed over their food, and they prayed over their drink. To brew was to participate in creation, to take the gifts of earth and transform them into sustenance. Their songs and chants often wove imagery of wine and ale, symbols of divine grace. Beer was not secular. It was sacramental in its own quiet way. So it was that monasteries preserved not only knowledge but flavor, not only scripture but recipes. Without their discipline, much of the art of brewing might have remained rustic, inconsistent, fleeting. Instead, their devotion gave Europe beer that could be trusted, beer that could endure, beer that could inspire. To sip from a monastic brew was to taste centuries of tradition, faith, and craft distilled into a single cup. In time, kings and nobles might claim the glory of battles, but monks claimed the quiet triumph of survival. Their beer-filled stomachs, warmed bodies, and united communities. And though the centuries have passed, some monasteries still brew today, keeping alive the ancient vow that through prayer, patience, and grain, they could serve both God and man with the same humble drink. If the monks brewed with discipline and devotion behind stone walls, then the lifeblood of brewing in villages flowed from the hands of women. Long before beer was an industry, it was a household task, as ordinary as baking bread or spinning wool. In cottages scattered across Europe, smoke rising from low chimneys marked not only the making of meals, but also the boiling of wort, tended by women who were called alewives. These women stood at the very heart of medieval brewing, their labor shaping daily survival, their skills passed down through generations. Alewives brewed for families first. In an age when water was unsafe, it fell to women to provide drink that would not sicken their children or husbands. Small beer, weak and nourishing, was their creation, poured into wooden bowls at the family table. But necessity soon bred opportunity. A woman who brewed well might make more than her family needed. With extra casks to spare, she could sell her ale to neighbors, travelers, or at the village market. Thus, alewives stepped into roles not only as caretakers, but as entrepreneurs. Picture the scene. A cottage doorway, a broom leaning against the threshold, a tall pointed hat upon the brewer's head to stand above the crowd, and a large bubbling cauldron simmering over the fire. To mark their trade, alewives often placed a long wooden pole, sometimes with a bundle of barley or a broom tied at the top, outside their homes. An early ale sign, much like the swinging tavern signs we know today. Neighbors knew at a glance where to find fresh ale. And within, the air was rich with the smell of boiling malt, the froth of fermenting beer, and the chatter of customers exchanging gossip as they waited. But the work was not easy. Brewing demanded knowledge of grain, fire, timing, and flavor. It was heavy labor, carrying water, stirring vats, lifting casks. It was uncertain. One mistake could turn ale sour, ruin grain, and destroy a family's income. And yet, for many women, brewing was independence. In a world where few paths allowed women to earn coin, ale gave them a livelihood, however precarious. Some grew prosperous, becoming fixtures of their communities. Others lived hand to mouth, their success dependent on weather, grain, and luck. It is here that history takes an eerie twist. Many of the symbols we now associate with witches trace back to these alewives. Their tall hats, a way to stand out in the market crowd. Their brooms, markers placed outside to signal ale was for sale. Their cauldrons, brewing vats, filled not with spells but with barley and water. Even the black cats, sometimes said to lurk at their feet, were mousers, keeping grain stores safe from vermin. Over time, suspicion and rivalry, often stoked by church and guilds who wanted to control brewing, turned these images sinister. Alewives, once respected, were painted as dangerous. Their tools of trade transformed into signs of sorcery. Despite suspicion, the demand for their product never waned. In bustling towns, alewives operated taverns, known as brew stalls, where villagers gathered to drink, argue, celebrate, or mourn. Their ale fueled festivals, weddings, and funerals alike. For a few coins, one could share in the life of the community. And behind the counter, the alewife presided. Equal parts brewer, hostess, and sometimes peacekeeper when tempers rose too high. Yet their success carried risk. As brewing became more profitable, men began to seize control. Guilds, which often excluded women, formed to regulate and tax brewing. Authorities imposed standards, licenses, and fees. Slowly, what had once been a woman's craft was claimed as a man's trade. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the independent alewife was fading, replaced by taverns run by men or by institutions such as monasteries and town breweries. Still, the memory of those women lingers in every tankard. For centuries, it was they who ensured that families drank safely, that villages had reason to gather, that beer flowed through festivals and ordinary days alike. They stood at the threshold of home and marketplace, transforming grain into sustenance, survival, and joy. Without them, medieval life would have been thirstier, harsher, lonelier. Alewives were more than brewers. They were keepers of life itself, misunderstood and often maligned, yet indispensable to their world. If bread filled the belly of the Middle Ages, beer quenched its thirst. From dawn to dusk, it was poured into cups of wood, horn, pewter, or silver. To speak of medieval life without beer would be to leave out its heartbeat, for it was not a luxury reserved for the few, but a daily necessity for all. In every village, town, and castle, beer was present, humble or splendid, depending on who held the cup. For peasants, beer was as common as water is to us. Their drink was usually small beer, a thin, lightly fermented brew made from the second or third run of the mash. Weak in alcohol, but rich in calories, it was safe to drink and filled the stomach. Children sipped it with their bread in the morning. Farmers carried jugs of it into the fields, where it fueled long hours of toil beneath the sun. At day's end, families gathered around the hearth, passing bowls of ale that eased fatigue and knit them together in fellowship. In towns, beer was more than nourishment. It was social glue. Taverns, brew stalls, and inns filled with laughter, quarrels, and song. Deals were struck over mugs of ale, friendships forged, feuds begun. The alehouse was where gossip spread faster than fire, where news traveled quicker than messengers. For the urban poor, it was a refuge from cold streets. For merchants, a place to boast of profits. For travelers, a taste of local flavor. Every town had its brew, and citizens took fierce pride in its quality. Nobles, by contrast, drank stronger ales. At feasts held in great halls, beer was served alongside roasted meats, pies, and spiced delicacies. Gold and silver goblets brimmed with potent brews far richer than what peasants could afford. These were not merely for thirst, but for display, a measure of wealth, hospitality, and power. A noble who poured freely was praised for generosity. One who was stingy with drink invited scorn. Strong ale accompanied hunting banquets, diplomatic negotiations, and even battle councils, its warmth loosening tongues and steeling courage. In monasteries, beer took on a dual role, practical and spiritual. Monks received daily rations, measured according to strict rules. During fasting seasons, beer became their sustenance, rich enough to nourish when solid food was forbidden. It was also shared with the poor, travelers, and pilgrims, a form of charity that filled bellies and saved lives. The monastery alehouse was not merely a place of consumption. It was an extension of Christian duty, where hospitality was as sacred as prayer. Even the sick turned to beer. Weak, watered-down ale was given to patients in hospitals, its calories offering strength when food could not be kept down. For women in childbirth, for the elderly, for children suffering fever, beer was thought gentler than wine or spirits, a restorative as much as a refreshment. In this way, it crossed the line between medicine and sustenance, becoming part of care as well as comfort. Yet beer was not only for necessity, it was joy in a mug. Festivals and fairs flowed with strong ale, brewed specially for the occasion. Harvest celebrations, weddings, saints' days, all were marked by abundant drink. Men staggered, women sang, and for a brief moment, the hardships of medieval life melted away in laughter. Drunkenness was common enough that preachers railed against it from pulpits, warning of sin and ruin. But still the mugs were raised, for what was a feast without ale? So in every corner of society, peasant cottages, bustling towns, noble courts, sacred monasteries, healing halls, beer was there. It was breakfast, lunch, and supper. It was laughter, prayer, and medicine. It sustained the hungry, cheered the weary, and united the divided. To drink beer in the Middle Ages was not a choice. It was survival, custom, identity. And in that frothing, cloudy brew, the story of life itself was told, daily, faithfully, endlessly. Beer was never just a drink. In the Middle Ages, it was an industry, a currency, and often a weapon of power. What began as a humble household necessity in peasant cottages grew into a force that shaped laws, filled treasuries, and fueled the rise of towns. To trace the story of beer is to follow the flow of wealth itself, for wherever beer was brewed, coin soon followed. At first, brewing was local, a domestic affair. Families made what they needed, and alewives sold surplus by the jug or pint. But demand was relentless. A village might empty its barrels quickly, forcing brewers to make batch after batch. In towns, taverns could not keep up with thirsty citizens, and soon brewing became a business rather than a household task. By the High Middle Ages, beer was one of the most consumed and most profitable goods in Europe, and governments knew it. They taxed it heavily. Taxes on beer filled royal coffers and city treasuries. In England, by the 13th century, ale was so vital that its price was regulated by law. The assize of ale decreed how much could be charged for a gallon, depending on the cost of grain. Inspectors, known as ale conners, patrolled markets and taverns, tasting samples to ensure quality and fairness. They knelt in sticky straw to test whether ale was too thin, or drank from mugs to judge its strength. Brewing was no longer just survival. It was subject to law and scrutiny, its value recognized by crown and council alike. In Germany and the Low Countries, guilds took control. These associations of brewers regulated production, maintained standards, and protected their members' trade. To join a guild was to gain prestige and security, but also obligation. Recipes, methods, and rites were guarded fiercely. A guild's reputation was its lifeblood, for the beer it produced carried the honor of an entire city. Towns like Bruges, Hamburg, and Munich rose to prominence not only through trade in wool or salt, but also in barrels of beer rolling through their gates. Beer even shaped trade routes. With the rise of hopped beer, which could last longer and travel further, merchants carried casks down rivers and across seas. The Hanseatic League, that great northern confederation of trading cities, dealt not only in timber, furs, and fish, but in beer. Hamburg's brews reached Scandinavia, while Flanders exported to England. Beer became a product of international commerce, binding regions together with foam-topped contracts as much as with parchment treaties. And where there was profit, there was rivalry. Lords and kings imposed monopolies on brewing, granting licenses to favored producers and punishing those who defied them. Cities fought over brewing rights with surrounding villages, knowing that to control beer was to control wealth. Laws banned peasants from selling outside their towns or forced brewers to buy from certain suppliers. Conflict over beer was never just about taste. It was about power. For the common worker, beer was more than a commodity. It was often part of wages. Laborers in towns, servants in castles, even soldiers on campaign were paid in daily rations of ale. A man might measure the worth of his toil not in coin, but in how many pints he received. Beer was money. Beer was food. Beer was survival. So much so that a shortage could spark riots, and the rise in ale prices could topple trust in rulers. Even religion could not resist the pull of profit. Monasteries, famous for their brewing, sold surplus ale to fund libraries, churches, and almshouses. Their beer was not only nourishment, but revenue. Pilgrims purchased it on journeys, villagers bought it in bulk, and kings themselves sometimes granted exemptions to monasteries as a recognition of their importance. Sacred hands poured beer, but gold filled the coffers. Thus, beer was more than sustenance in the Middle Ages. It was law, labor, and livelihood. It built guild halls, filled treasuries, and fueled armies. In every cask rolled to market, in every pint poured at a tavern, there was more than drink. There was the story of an economy rising from grain and water, turning necessity into profit, survival into power. Beer, humble and frothy, was one of the pillars upon which medieval society balanced its fragile weight. In the Middle Ages, beer was more than grain and water, more than profit and tax. It was meaning. It was ritual. It was a vessel of belief that carried with it echoes of the sacred, the mystical, and the communal. To sip from a mug of ale was not only to nourish the body, but to participate, whether knowingly or not, in centuries of tradition and symbols that shaped how people saw their world. To the peasant, beer was the blessing of harvest, a liquid born from the sweat of fields and the mercy of weather. When the grain sprouted and the vats bubbled, it was a sign that God had not abandoned them. A good brew was a promise of life, a spoiled one, perhaps a punishment or a warning. In villages, the act of brewing itself often carried ritual. Women muttered prayers as they stirred, charms were tied to vats, and saints were invoked to watch over the fermentation. Brewing was as much supplication as skill. Within monasteries, beer was tied to devotion. Monks called it cerevisia, a drink permitted during fasting, a gift that strengthened the body so that the soul might remain vigilant in prayer. For them, brewing was an act of humility and service, providing for their brothers, for pilgrims, for the poor. To drink their beer was to partake in a labor sanctified by prayer, a sip of nourishment wrapped in holiness. Even Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary nun of the 12th century, wrote of hops not only as preservers of beer, but as part of God's design, tools of creation meant to aid mankind. Yet beer also belonged to celebration. At harvest festivals, mugs were raised in thanks, laughter rolling like thunder across the village green. At weddings, barrels were tapped in honor of the union, their froth a symbol of abundance and joy. Even funerals were not without ale. Mourners drank to the memory of the departed, believing that to share beer together was to carry the spirit of the dead into the living community. Beer was the glue of ritual, present in moments of sorrow and delight, its presence a reminder that life itself was fleeting, but community endured. Symbols clung to beer like foam to a mug. Its color, dark or light, was likened to the richness of the earth, its froth to purity, its bitterness to the trials of life. In tavern songs, beer was praised as comforter, friend, even healer of woes. To raise a mug in a toast was not only camaraderie, but magic, a way of binding men together in trust. Soldiers before battle drank from the same cask, believing that the shared ale gave them courage, made them brothers in arms. In this way, beer was not just a drink. It was covenant, unspoken but powerful. Superstition, too, wound its way into brewing. Some believed evil spirits could sour a batch, and so brewers hung charms, crosses, or even horse skulls above their doors to ward them off. In parts of Scandinavia, brewers whispered incantations over vats, blending pagan custom with Christian prayer. The line between science, faith, and magic blurred, for beer was mysterious, alive, unpredictable. When it fermented well, it was divine favor. When it failed, dark forces were suspected. Even politics adopted the language of beer. A ruler who provided barrels for festivals was praised as generous, a father of his people. One who taxed ale too harshly was seen as cruel, draining joy from his subjects' lives. To control beer was to control not just the economy, but the spirit of a community. A happy village with full mugs was loyal. A thirsty village was dangerous. And so beer became more than drink. It was symbol. It carried the harvest, the faith, the joy, the sorrow, the fear, and the fellowship of medieval life. In every toast, in every shared mug, there was more than liquid, there was meaning. Beer was not just what people drank. It was what they believed, what they celebrated, what they feared, and what they hoped. It was life itself, captured in a cup. Step into a tavern today, and you will find yourself surrounded by echoes of the Middle Ages. The golden pint set before you, frothy and fragrant, is not a modern invention, but the descendant of 1,000 years of brewing, perfected by monks, nurtured by alewives, guarded by guilds, and consumed by peasants and kings alike. The story of medieval beer did not end when the Middle Ages faded. It carried forward, shaping the way we brew, drink, and celebrate even now. The greatest legacy lies in hops. Though resisted at first, their bitter touch transformed brewing forever. By the late Middle Ages, hopped beer dominated Germany and the Low Countries, spreading outward until it conquered Europe entire. Without hops, beer would have remained fragile, souring within days. With them, it became durable, tradable, and complex. Every crisp pint of lager or IPA today owes its existence to that medieval discovery, to those patient monks and daring brewers who first embraced the strange flower of the hop vine. Another legacy rests in regulation. The medieval world's obsession with controlling beer, through the assize of ale in England, the beer guilds in Germany, the monopolies of towns, laid the foundation for modern standards of brewing. The Bavarian Reinheitsgebot of 1516, the famous purity law, which decreed that beer must be made only from barley, water, and hops, was the child of medieval tradition, an attempt to fix in law what practice had already established. Even now, many German brewers boast of their purity, heirs to a law more than 500 years old. The monasteries, too, left their mark. Trappist ales still brewed in cloisters in Belgium, and the Netherlands carry the taste of history in every sip. To drink them is to taste the Middle Ages alive and unbroken, recipes passed from one generation of monks to the next, guided by prayer and patience. Even secular breweries borrow the imagery of monks, abbeys, and cloisters for the association between beer and the holy remains etched into memory. And what of the alewives? Those women who once stood at cottage doors with cauldrons bubbling and broomsticks raised as signs. Though guilds and laws pushed them aside, their legacy lingers in every craft brewer today who brews at home, in small batches, with creativity and care. The spirit of household brewing has returned with modern craft beer, where innovation echoes the past. Strange herbs, fruits, and spices once common in medieval groot ales now find their way into experimental brews. In truth, every daring brewer is an alewife reborn, challenging tradition with fire and grain. Culturally, beer still carries the same weight it did in the Middle Ages. It binds people. In taverns, pubs, and beer halls, strangers sit together, share pints, and find common ground. To raise a glass today is no different than when peasants clinked wooden mugs at a wedding feast, or when monks toasted in their refectories. The symbolism endures. Beer is laughter, comfort, courage, and companionship. It was so in the year 1200, and it remains so in 2025. The legacy is also written in the economy. Brewing is a global industry worth billions, yet it is still tied to pride of place, just as medieval towns once boasted of their local ale. Today, Munich is known for Oktoberfest, Belgium for Trappist beers, Ireland for its stout, the Czech lands for Pilsner. Regional identity, born in the Middle Ages, continues to define the world of beer. To drink a pint is not only to enjoy flavor, but to taste a nation's history, its soil, its people. And perhaps the greatest legacy is memory. When we drink, we participate in a tradition as old as civilization itself, one that carried humanity through plague, famine, and hardship. The medieval man who raised his cup to his lips would recognize something in our own gestures today. The relief, the warmth, the fellowship found in beer. Across centuries, beer has remained what it always was. Bread turned liquid, survival turned into celebration, necessity transformed into joy. So the next time a frothy pint is set before you, remember that you are not only drinking beer, you are tasting history, the sweat of peasants, the prayers of monks, the labors of alewives, the laws of kings. You are drinking the Middle Ages itself, alive, enduring, and foaming in your glass.